In this lecture, we're going to talk about central banks. Now, if we're talking about the central bank in the United States, the Federal Reserve, it's existed since 1913. And the central bank, the Federal Reserve that we have, is actually the third attempt, I think, to create a central bank in the United States. So let's look at something here. Sorry. Let's just start. So the very first one, which I don't think this is in the book, but the very first one is in 1791 with George Washington. And that bank is called like the First National Bank, I think. And I think it lasted for like 20 years, something like that. I'm sure you can look it up on Wikipedia. You don't need me to give you bad history. Then there was a second one. The second one was located in like Philadelphia. And I think it came out in like the 1820s or 1830s. Then we fought against each other, right, during the Civil War. And that war was incredibly expensive. And basically, the United States, the North, the Union, and the South, the Confederacy, faced three choices about how to finance the war. Let's review these here. So how do you pay for a war, or really for anything? You can print more currency. Now, if you do that, it will cause inflation. So you don't want to do it too much. You can issue bonds. Or you can impose taxes. Now, the Civil War turns out to be incredibly important because it's during the Civil War that you get the first income tax. It's during the Civil War that you actually start to get large-scale issuance of bonds. And it's during the Civil War that you get the US currency starting to be printed nationally, what are called greenbacks. Now, the North, the Union, funded most of its operations with bonds, something like 50 to 60%. No, actually close to 60%. And this is about 25%. And this is about 15%. These are just approximate. The result of printing that much cash was that the inflation rate in the North was about 90%. So that means that prices just about doubled between like 1861 and 1865. In the South, they financed their operations mainly with printing more currency. And the South had 9,000% inflation. Now, usually when it comes to a debate, I kind of say, well, you're free to think what you want. And I guess I could say that here too. I mean, I'm not trying to say you had to believe in the cause of the North or the cause of the South. But you could certainly say that it's pretty detrimental to have 9,000% inflation in the South. And that's one reason, probably among many, many others, why the Confederacy lost the war. Um, I'm saying all this and why, let's go back here. Why does this matter for why we talk about central banks? Because the issuance of bonds and the printing of more currency was only possible because there was the establishment of a national banking system. Some 1,000 banks were established between 1861 and 1865 that those banks were subject to federal regulations and they had to buy bonds to insure their deposits. Now, that banking law, the National Banking Act of 1863, that banking system eventually fails as well, but it becomes the precursor to the Federal Reserve. So in the lead up to that, in 1907, there was an incredibly severe economic recession, economic crisis. So much so that the economy was near collapse in 1907. The only thing that saved it was the richest person in the United States, Pierpont Morgan, had to basically bail out the US economy. Now, things are pretty bad if you have to rely on the richest person to bail us out. And that was complicated further by the fact that the president at the time, Theodore Roosevelt, was very much a populist, a person for the people. So he wanted to create a new lender of last resort. And that was really the most important thing that the Federal Reserve, when it was created, was supposed to do, was it was supposed to lend money when no one else would or could. Now, it's also the monetary authority. It determines monetary policy. But at the time of 1913, there really was no such thing as monetary policy. You really don't get monetary policy until the 1930s with John Maynard Keynes. In the beginning, the Federal Reserve was just supposed to be the lender of last resort. And what it is it's organized as a, I don't know if they give us a map here. They don't. I'm just going to pick a map here. That was a very crappy map. Really? That's the best map you can give me? That's painful. There we go. Okay, so 12 districts were created and a board of governors. So the board of governors in Washington, D.C. serves to coordinate the operations of the 12 branches. As you'll notice here on this pretty bad map, the Alaska and Hawaii are missing. Alaska and Hawaii are part of District 12, which is San Francisco. And in our Hunger Games map of the United States, you'll see that the economy is largely oriented towards the east in 1913 when this map was drawn up. So like New York State gets its own. Ohio and parts of middle of nowhere Kentucky and Pennsylvania gets its own. I used to work for District 7, which is Chicago, so Midwest. Um, you'll notice here that there's some areas like the Minneapolis district, which I think is District 9, um, covers a pretty wide area. District 12, again, San Francisco is a pretty broad area. But what's each of those individual regions kind of reflect different aspects of our economy, if you think about it, right? Like the St. Louis district, District 8, is going to be agricultural. Um, Kansas City, right, is going to be a lot about wheat and trains, transportation of that wheat. Myself in District 7, we had mainly train transportation, highway infrastructure, automobile suppliers, because that's what's made in the upper Midwest. Um, and what they do is they feed in their little visions of what's happening in their little regional economy to the Board of Governors. And that then informs what the monetary policy is going to be. Now, originally, when the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, there was a gold standard. It was also, as I said, the lender of last resort. But that gold standard, that was essentially the monetary policy. It drove the monetary policy decisions. You could only change the money supply as you had gold. The one of the earliest things that Franklin Roosevelt does with what Franklin Roosevelt does with the Great Depression is that he suspends the gold standard. And so then cash can be printed more freely. Um, now, what this Federal Reserve System has to do is it's subject to what's called a real bills doctrine, and that would be is that you only a bank that's part of the central bank is only going to get a loan if it's got funds to support that loan. Um, Commercial banks are not going to be allowed to just borrow money and then invest in a loan portfolio for speculative profit making purposes. The real bills ensures that the commercial bank is only going to ask for a loan if it absolutely needs it. Now, if you have to borrow from the Federal Reserve, you have to pay an interest rate. That interest rate, as we know, is called a discount rate. So each of the Federal Reserve districts, when I was again at Chicago, we actually did have a discount window. Sometimes you can kind of, again, when I was there in the late '90s, early 2000s, most of these things were starting to go away. I think. Well, yeah. So basically, the discount window was basically a desk that a banker would go to be able to get a loan, and nothing more than that. But it's pretty old. You really don't see that kind of thing anymore. Hey, is that Homer Jones? I bet you that's a picture of Homer Jones. What do you think? You're like, who? Who the fuck are you talking about? No, seriously, I think that's Homer Jones, one of the probably one of my very favorite Federal Reserve economists. If I have to list them, it's hard to have a favorite, right? It's like saying you have a favorite kid or something like that. Um, so that gets us 1913 all the way to the Great Depression. Great Depression, things pretty much change, and it changes in part because once we suspend the gold standard, Now the Federal Reserve can change the money supply. Well, then how are they going to change the money supply? What's going to inform that process? That's where we get the Banking Act of 1935 into creating the FOMC. That committee, which exists to this day, is actually the committee that determines interest rates in the economy and largely determines most monetary policy in the United States. That committee consists of the 7 members of the Board of Governors. The New York branch is always there. And the reason why the New York branch is always there is because that's where the equity market and the bond market, obviously Wall Street, is in that district. So it needs to always be on the FOMC. And then it has rotating members of the other regions. The current Board of Governors, chair of the Board of Governors today is Jay Powell. And that person, Jay Powell, succeeded Janet Yellen, who actually used to be the 12th district, our district, Federal Reserve District 12 president for San Francisco. Before Janet Yellen was Ben Bernanke, and before Ben Bernanke was Alan Greenspan. The person before that was probably the best Federal Reserve chairperson ever, Paul Volcker, who passed away not too long ago. And Paul Volcker, 1979. So Paul Volcker, 1979 to 1987. Then you've got 1988 to about 2005-ish. This is Greenspan. These are kind of approximate here. I think that would be Bernanke. But these dates could be off by a few years. I don't know when she would have been, like 17, 16, 17, 18, something like that. That would be Yellen. And then Jay Powell. It's a 4-year renewable term by the president, confirmed by the Senate. Oh man, you get these, and I try not to be political, but oh geez, what a horrible kitten. Already you can tell I'm gonna be grumpy if I'm I really don't there was this kind of push for a while that that Trump wanted to remove Jay Powell. He said that he had the power to do so. Oh, look at that one right there. You got Janet Yellen in the middle there in the purple, Ben Bernanke right there on the right-hand side. And then you've got Jay Powell on the left-hand side. Oh, let's just watch this, dude. I haven't seen this, but let's watch it.
Last month, Bernanke announced the Fed's intent to buy $600 billion in U.S. Treasury securities, which is supposed to have the effect of lowering rates on long-term loans for things like cars and homes. Bernanke wanted to emphasize that these are the Fed's own reserves. It's not tax money, and it doesn't add to the federal deficit.
What did you see
that
caused you to pull the trigger on the $600 billion at this point?
It has to do with two aspects. The first is unemployment. The other concern I should mention is that inflation is very, very low, which you think is a good thing and normally is a good thing, but we're getting awfully close to the range where prices would actually start falling.
Falling prices lead to falling wages. It lets the steam out of the economy, and you
Exactly.
start spiraling downward.
Exactly.
You were
And there's Jay
skeptical
Powell.
at one time of some of the things that Chair Bernanke did during the financial crisis.
So I and a number of others raised questions about quantitative easing, and I felt that was my obligation and the right thing to do. I hope I did it in a constructive way. And some years ago, I came to the view that that the risks I'd identified really didn't come to bear. So I did support the actions that Ben was proposing as chair, and we try to learn from these things. These are some of these things that don't have a precedent. And so you've got to go through them and bring your best thinking and then learn lessons from what's happened.
So fortunately, even though, it talks a little bit like a politician, so you shouldn't get this notion that these people are, to be a Federal Reserve chairman, you've got to have some good politics at something here. I'm sure you could read these all here. I'm not gonna read these all. No, I'm not gonna. This is gonna make me grumpy. The reason why it would make me grumpy is because what's incredibly important for economists is that the Federal Reserve chairperson, in this case Jay Powell, needs to not be able to be removed. Unless he's like, drunk driving and running over pedestrians, right? He's not supposed to get removed from office for the monetary policy decisions he makes. Because presidents want to get reelected. They all do, right? That's their very nature. Right? It's like why cats chase mice. It's what they do. And you can't blame the cat for chasing the mouse or the dog for chasing the cat. And you can't blame the politician for wanting to get reelected. But you stop them, right? So, we create a safety system that basically says that the Federal Reserve chairperson basically has a term that's going to last the life of the presidency. And generally speaking, when that's not followed, when the central bank is not independent, that generally leads to higher inflation. And the reason why is because sorry. Okay. Sorry. Sorry, it's just not gonna work. I'll just say it. So if the goal of the politician is to get reelected, they're gonna want a strong economy. The only way you can temporarily boost the economy is by printing more money. People then spend that money, and at least for a little while, the economy seems to be performing better and better and better. And then what happens is you get inflation. So the Federal Reserve chairman during the Nixon administration did exactly that. Nixon wanted to get reelected. The Federal Reserve chairperson basically accommodated that by printing more cash. And the result was that in the 1970s, we had 10-15% inflation, which then required Paul Volcker to basically remove that rampantly high inflation. And we have not had significant inflation for most of my lifetime, for some 30-40 years, primarily because the Federal Reserve chairperson has been independent of the political process. Now, let's talk about the Board of Governors. In the Board of Governors, you've got 6 governors. They serve incredibly long time periods, 14 years. They are completely insulated from the political process. And they basically run, they serve to manage the districts within the central bank. They operate the Fed, and they importantly control the money supply by their presence on the FOMC. They also regulate banks. One of the quietly a change that was made about 3 or 4 months ago was called Regulation N. They dropped a regulation that basically distinguishes between savings accounts and checking accounts. It used to be that a savings account was less liquid because you could only do 6 transactions in a month in a savings account. Now that restriction has been lifted. That lifting of that restriction was done by the Board of Governors. Oh, there's a map finally. So what's not listed on here are unlike that other map we looked at, would be the kind of like satellite offices. In our District 12, there's one in Salt Lake, there's one in, I think, Phoenix, and I think the other one is in Seattle, I think, or Portland. And they basically help the San Francisco, and the LA too. LA has one too, and they help the San Francisco district do its job. Okay, so again, going back to the FOMC and who's on it, again, it's 12 individuals, all 7 members of the Board of Governors, always New York, and then a rotating 4. What they're looking at quite a bit is the Beige Book. And that would give us our regional economic conditions. That was a lot of what I was involved in with District 7, was basically feet on the ground, trying to determine what's going on locally, regionally in District 7, so that can be written up and sent to the Board of Governors, which helps them then define their decision. If we look at how this looks, just look at the most recent one here. So what the Beige Book does is it's broken down by district. Let's just look at my old district, Chicago. So what you'll see here is that it's like anecdotal, right? One aluminum, sorry, said, right, so here you've got like here where it's saying like one aluminum producer said they were struggling to meet the demand because they couldn't hire enough workers even after raising wages. So it seems anecdotal, right? So it's going to talk about certain stores, certain malls, certain like things, right? Like certain small things here, right? Like they're talking about Indianapolis and construction of industrial space in Indianapolis. These are pretty small things, but they're important because they all feed into a much broader picture about how the economy is doing. Here's another one. A wholesale car retailer noted that a recent wave of repossessions will lead to higher used car inventories and lower prices. A contact from a brewery reported elevated price of aluminum is eating away at profit margins. Now, the Federal Reserve also does some other things as well. It does look at bank soundness, meaning does it have enough deposits to meet the needs of the customers? It is the bank for the government. So it does its job. It also, to some extent, but not a ton, it does implement consumer protection laws, mainly the Fair Lending Act, which basically says that you're not going to get charged at different rates, interest rates because of your race or ethnicity, and that you'll have equal access to a home loan if you want to, like, regardless of where you want to build your house in the city. And then it also disseminates data. Again, the best place for data, fred.stlouisfed.org. Federal Reserve Economic Database.stlouisfed.org. So for you accounting people out there, you know who you are, and you like balance sheets, what are the assets of the Federal Reserve? Well, the primary one would be securities. These securities are bonds, other government-sponsored entity bonds, currency. There's some gold in there too. If we look at I show you this because it should bother you and concern you. If you look at how much the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve has grown since the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, that again, we're still recovering from. At that time, as you'll see in this chart, the balance sheet was about a little bit less than $1 trillion. Oh, it says right up there, $870 billion in August of 2007. By 2015, it has grown nearly 5 times to 4.5 trillion. And then it obviously dramatically increases with COVID-19, such that it's nearly $8 trillion. That would seem concerning if I were still with the central bank. Now, we do have other banks, other central banks around the world. The Bank of Japan, it is also pretty independent, does many of the same, has a similar structure to the Federal Reserve, even though the Bank of Japan precedes that. It's usually shortened as BOJ. So Federal Reserve System is just generally called the Fed. Bank of Japan, BOJ. Then you got the Bank of England. I have visited the Bank of England in London. It's obviously incredibly old. Again, same kinds of behaviors here in terms of ensuring monetary policy is followed. Dude, it's old, right? That's like the time of like Shakespeare and shit, as far as I know. Then you get ECB. Obviously, the UK is not part of the European Central Union, the European Central Bank. European Central Bank comes out in 1998, and it's headquartered in Frankfurt. The members of the European Central Bank are the members of the Eurozone. Now, the only thing that the European Central Bank concerns itself with a little bit more is maintaining the value of the euro compared to other currencies. And that's primarily because the euro is a relatively new currency that's only about 20 some years old. And then finally, here we have the Bank of Canada. And the Bank of Canada is, again, it's a little bit different in that it's actually a government agency. The Federal Reserve is actually independent of the government. The Bank of Canada, it's not the case. It's actually part of the government. It engages in monetary policy, same thing as the other central banks, and it maintains the financial system. Okay, so I hope that gives you a pretty good overview of central banking, primarily in the United States, but also its similarities to everywhere else around the world.